Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Laura Wallace. Laura is a social psychologist. She has her PhD in social psych from Ohio State University. She's currently doing research at George Mason University. Particularly, most of her work centers on how do people change their minds, what's the nature of people's motivation for change, how do people act on their beliefs, and how do institutions communicate in ways that promote progress. And that's what all of her research is on. That's what her publications are on in the scientific literature. And that's what we talk about in this episode. We start the conversation by talking about source bias. I think that's what she's mostly published on. We talk about what sources are and how bias is defined. We talk about perceived bias and its importance, and does perceived bias in one area spill over into another area for a person. We talk about the differences between biases and opinions. We talk about trustworthiness, right, and the differences between perceived bias and perceived trustworthiness. And we have a nice discussion about perception, and the absolute truth of something is sometimes irrelevant because the perceived way of understanding something, or the perceived truthfulness or perceived bias, is usually what is the active ingredient between interactions with people. We give some examples of journalism and its biases. We also talk about attitudes. We give kind of a definition of attitudes and how they're very similar, synonymous with opinions and the overall tenets of attitudes. We talk about attitude strength, certainty. We also talk about persuasion and morals, attractability, and some of the ways in which how do people come to changing their minds or being persuaded, if there's some idea that they are already having those kinds of intuitions, along with many other topics. This was such a fun conversation. As I told Laura, I always like chatting with social psychologists because they're thinking about things, kind of how it impacts groups, or how do groups of people do things. And it's always so much fun to think about what that looks like for individuals, but then also just groups at large. One of the lighter sides is we kind of stick with this conversation about chocolate ice cream, and it just kind of becomes like this prevailing theme throughout the conversation, which I got a big kick out of. So you'll hear that in the conversation about my less of an affinity towards chocolate ice cream and her strong affinity, and just using that as a fun example to kind of get at some of these hard topics. So now I bring you Laura Wallace. I'm here with Laura Wallace. Laura, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this. So tell listeners a little bit of who you are and what your main interests of research and study and what you do and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I am trained as a social psychologist. I got my PhD from Ohio State University. I'm currently a postdoc at George Mason University. Mm-hmm. I generally think about my research program as examining the psychology of social change. So within that kind of broad topic, I'm interested in when and how do people change their minds? When will people actually take action on whatever beliefs they have? And how do institutions influence those different kinds of factors? But a lot of my work has looked at specifically perceiving other people as biased and how that might be different from other perceptions when we infer it, and what the consequences might be of perceiving someone as biased.
So this is super fascinating stuff. I know people talk about this kind of in a more general sense out in the world, but one of the things that I like about your research is that you're looking at it within, obviously from a social psych lens, but looking at it from a research orientation, right? So, which is really helpful. And so I guess the one thing that, I've read many of your papers and they're quite good. The first thing that I've seen that you've written about a lot is source bias. Can you maybe tell us what source bias is? You can be as nerdy and technical as you want. It's no problem. Tell us what it is and some of the broad brushstrokes and maybe a little bit of the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what a source is. My training is in persuasion or attitude change. And one of the things that we think influences whether or not someone's persuaded is the person or entity that the message comes from. So we call that a source. And you could think about sources as like politicians, for example, or doctors or advertisements. For advertisements, it'd be the company that is advertising, or if there was a celebrity endorser, that would be the source, but it's whoever the message is coming from. Mm-hmm. And researchers and persuasion researchers specifically have been really interested in sources because sources can influence persuasion attempts, particularly when sources are more credible, meaning you believe what they have to say, you're more likely to be persuaded by them. So my research specifically looks at source bias, meaning what happens when we perceive that the source has a bias. And when I say bias, I specifically mean that they have some sort of skew or slant in their view. And that could either be because they're motivated to take a particular position or because they've been exposed to slanted information. But importantly, it doesn't really matter whether the source is actually biased or not. What matters is how the person who's receiving the message perceives them as biased or not.
So essentially, source can be pretty much anything. Yeah. So it could be a doctor, it could be a certain, publication or an outlet. It could be, there are many things or many entities that have the potential to be defined as a source. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so when you talk about bias now, what you're describing sounds like is there a perceived bias or not, or how much is that showing, whether there actually is a bias or not? So we'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of bias, could you say that for individuals, we all carry biases all the time? That's inescapable, right? Like I have a bias, you have a bias that's probably influenced by a variety of variables, right? Where I come from, or my experiences, or my age, or
the relationships you have.
My relationships, my education, etc. And those things are contributing. Those are some of the pieces, I guess, or the parts of contributing to a bias I may or may not have. And so is that about right? Or how do you, just in a general sense, just in terms of kind of flattening the definition, how would you understand bias in and of itself as a construct?
Yeah, so I would say bias is really about theoretically there's some true thing, right? And lots of times we don't know what this is, but to just use a really concrete, not that relevant to the real world example, let's say you and I are standing 50 feet apart from one another. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to estimate the distance. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're 40 feet apart from each other, and you think we're 60 feet apart from each other. I'm biased towards thinking we're closer together than we are, and you are biased towards thinking we're farther apart than we are. Mm-hmm. And those biases could stem from slanted exposure. So maybe I've only been exposed to things that are way farther apart than we actually are before, or they could stem from motivation. So maybe I'm feeling anxious about getting COVID from you, And that's making me view the distance between us as shorter than it is. So that's like a motivation coloring my view. But that's like a very, when people are talking about biases, they're not usually talking about distances, and we don't often know what the true value is. And so what the value of truth is. And so like any bias is a perception, or perceived bias is perception that someone's opinion or belief is different than what the truth is. It's slanted in one direction or another. But we're often talking about, for example, ideological biases, where someone's liberal or someone's conservative, and that's coloring their view of a policy. But we could talk about biases in relationships. Like, I'm sure I view my partner much more favorably than someone else would. So whatever the topic is can be colored by relevant features of the person. But for example, like, I don't think my relationship with my partner colors my political views necessarily. For some people they could, but you know, who we are doesn't color every single opinion that we hold.
Yeah. So we can say that there's obviously biases that we all have. Now, the typical, I think, space that people go to is they usually see a bias as something that's negative, or that people will make some attribution about that, right? This is a negative bias, or this is a positive bias, or, you know, people will kind of colloquially say like, well, this is just a biased account, right? You know, on if it's, you know, some essay or some piece of journalism, or, you know, as an example. But we do have biases, and but they're inescapable in that way, right? We are going to have priors about something. Now, in terms of perceived bias, you know, how does this function, right? Because you're talking about this idea of truth, which is that's a messy term, right? You know what, right? Because usually people have to think about some sort of absolute truth, or some truth at bottom, or, you know, or the idea of truth. But there's the perceived biases, you know, in a certain example, what is it that somebody is seeing that could be the bias, and whether that lines up with what it actually is, right? How would you explain the perceived piece of this?
Yeah, I actually think it's a really important part of this, because what I think is the truth and what you think is the truth may both differ from one another, and they may both differ from what the actual truth is. And you and I might, neither one of us, be able to actually access what the truth is. So the field example, it's really easy. We could take out a measuring tape and see like there's 50 feet between us, but there's lots and lots of issues and topics for which it's really hard to know what the truth is. So a really robust finding in both my work and others' work is that we use agreement to infer perceived bias. So if you and I have the same opinion, I think you are way less biased than somebody who has a different opinion than I do. And that's amplified for topics that are moralized.
Do you have any ideas or hypotheses or results as to why? Why is it the agreement that's important? Is it just a kind of some sort of similarity where it's like, well, we have a similar notion, so this person believes similar to how I do, so they must be right? Or is it, why is that the kind of way of this agreement piece that's there, you think?
Yeah, okay, so you're saying something that's super, super interesting. Okay, so I'm going to answer your question specifically first, and then I'm going to answer it in a more general way. So specifically, let's say like a specific topic. Let's do something silly like chocolate ice cream. So let's say you and I both love chocolate ice cream, and I think that's the correct view. Like, I'm like, yes, that's truth. Chocolate ice cream is amazing. And I'm like, Javier agrees with me. Perfect. That's an unbiased view, because that's what I think the truth is. And someone who does not like chocolate ice cream has a slanted view because they have a negative attitude towards chocolate ice cream. So I think it comes down to like, you and I agree on what is truth. And obviously everyone thinks that they're not biased. That's naive realism. Anybody who has the same information that I do and reaches the same conclusions is not biased because I'm not biased. And anybody who reaches a different conclusion must be biased because I am not. So that's the naive realism piece. And I have, that's the agreement piece. Okay, I'm just going to leave that there. It would be interesting, and I don't have any data on this, so this is just, I'll be clear, this is me speculating. What would be really interesting is if I know that you like chocolate ice cream, and now that makes me think your political views are less biased. If it like the spillover. Which I do have work showing that perceived bias can spill over to even unrelated topics. So if I think you're biased about politics, all of a sudden I think you're biased about your preferences for consumer goods as well. So that I do have that showing that kind of link. So I do think that could happen.
Yeah, so it's almost like taking something localized and making it globalized about the person, right? So the bias is this here, right? So, and I think I don't know if I've seen in your work or maybe other works where that can tend to happen, right? Where people will have, you can make certain inferences about how bias in one area is bias, you see the spillover. But so, okay, so we have these ways where it's like this idea of agreement. Oh, so this idea of maybe, do you think it's just a misunderstanding or anything? But I mean, everybody has a bias. Everyone is biased in some way.
I think that's true, but I do also think people vary in how biased they are on given topics. So we all have biases, and we are all biased. We all have biases. We're all more and less biased on different things. So, for example, we expect judges in our society to be relatively less biased. Like that is their job, is like be as objective as you possibly can. Right. And conversely, we expect prosecutors and to in fact be biased, like you, right? And so we actually do have these roles in society where we specifically tell people your job is to be objective and your job is to be biased. And I think relative to one another, probably judges are on average less biased than prosecutors, right? And so people do all have biases, but people also vary in how biased they are on different kinds of things.
And that could be as a way or a structure of how we've built society, no? Like we've organized a judicial system to say judges have, neutrality or, objectivity. And then there's other people that are right. Defense attorneys and prosecutors, they're in this person's corner, right? They're in their camp. They're trying to, be biased for them because that's, their client or, whatever. Right. But people believe they are not biased.
It's true. People tend to believe they're not biased.
I know this, but it still is hard for me to sometimes really accept that fact. Everyone's going to be biased, right? I mean, I guess people see it as a dirty word. I don't see it as a dirty word, but again, I think you're making a good point that people, but this is about talking about spillover. This is an important point, right? Because I could be strongly biased towards coffee ice cream. I'm favorable to coffee ice cream, not so much chocolate ice cream.
Okay, well, I think you're biased then.
Yes, I am. I don't know why. It's my taste buds or something. Chocolate just doesn't do it for me. I know that's kind of like, taboo to say, but coffee ice cream though is just like, man, I could eat a whole carton of that right now. but I'm not going to feel because I feel so strongly or biased about, I mean, that's a preference. I mean, but I have a bias towards coffee ice cream. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be so biased as to, I only read the New York Times or I only read or watch Fox News. It doesn't, because I'm strongly biased in one way, doesn't mean I'm going to be strongly biased in another way necessarily. But you're saying that there's that spillover effect, right? Where people will have, in a completely different category, the assumption or the perception will be, well, this is just, because it is like kind of value statement about a person, right? Is, well, you're a biased individual, right? Or no, am I wrong on that?
I think when that spillover happens, it is people being like, well, you just seem like the kind of person who isn't totally rational about things. Mm-hmm. I will say in that spillover work, we do find that if you kind of remind people like, hey, these things aren't that related, they will stop this spillover. So for unrelated topics, but they'll still carry them over to related topics. So people basically always carry perceived bias over if they form the perception of another person as biased on a political topic, they'll carry it over to other political topics. And like I said, sometimes they'll carry it over to like consumer goods. But if you remind them, like, actually, people's opinions of consumer goods and politics are quite different, they won't carry the perceived bias over to the less related topics.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, I don't know how much you've written on this, so if you don't care to speak on it, it's fine. Is there a distinction between individuals and then institutions or groups, right, in terms of bias? So as an example, if I'm buying, I don't know, I'm buying some kind of good, some kind of, I'm buying Girl Scout cookies or something. I don't know. I can't think of anything. Right. And then I'm getting, buying cookies from so-and-so company or whatever, right? They both have a bias, but do we have in the person that is perceiving this, is there a certain type of bias we place on institutions or groups or companies as opposed to individuals? So for example, well, of course, Apple wants me to buy the next iPhone because they're just big capitalists and that's what they want me to do, as opposed to the individual who's selling me their used iPhone because they want to get rid of it or something like that. I mean, do we have, and as I don't know if specifically if you've talked about this delineation, but do we have a different perception of bias based on whether it's coming from an individual or whether it's coming from like a group or an entity or a company?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have any data on that. I'm happy to randomly, wildly speculate, which is my sense is that we actually might perceive stronger biases from groups. And the reason I think that, let me qualify that. Groups that we perceive as entitative is a fancy word psychologists like to use, but it just means like, how much are they a single entity? How much are they a single unit? And groups that seem like a single unit, like Apple endorsing Apple products, I think people would likely perceive them as highly biased because they're sort of all united around this goal of Apple products. Or like a religion might function that way, especially a religion that doesn't allow for a lot of deviations.
Right.
On the other hand, like you have religions like Unitarian Universalism, where like a plurality of beliefs are welcome, or like if Apple made a statement about whatever ice cream, like you probably know, like people who work at Apple probably have different ice cream preferences, and there's a lot of heterogeneity there. So I think it probably depends on like how much do you perceive like this group all agrees and they're all united around this particular belief. And that might be a case where you say they're really biased. I do think one thing I want to say, I actually think it's important to differentiate biases from opinions.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think every opinion is biased. So I don't know which opinions are biased or not, but theoretically, there are some opinions that are completely aligned with the truth, and those are not necessarily opinions that are in the middle. So there are some, you could be extremely favorable or extremely opposed to something, and if the evidence supports it, that's right. So, for example, like most people think of incest as highly negative, and most people probably think that, and I have data showing this, most people think the unbiased opinion towards incest is to be highly negative towards it, not to be like, I don't know, some good, some bad, I'm neutral towards it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to make sure to separate biases from opinions or taking a stance or having a direction in your view. I mean, I also don't think like the normative view is also the unbiased one, because like, there are also lots of points in histories where like people clearly, when we all believed the world was flat, that was clearly a biased view that everyone held. But
Right.
so bias is about like what's true. What's hard is we don't always know what that is, but we do certainly make inferences about it and about whether other people's opinions seem to be consistent with those facts. And that's kind of what my research is all about.
Yeah. So kind of on that, you talk about persuasion, you talk about trustworthiness in terms of source bias. Yeah. I don't know if you want to tackle one or the other in particular order, what makes sense to you, but maybe talk about those two concepts as well.
Yeah, so trustworthiness is really important. So I mentioned a while back that researchers are interested in sources because they can affect how persuasive a persuasion attempt is. And especially researchers have been interested in how expert a source seems and how trustworthy or honest the source seems. And for the last 60 years, researchers have been like, okay, trustworthiness and expertise are the two important source characteristics. Those each feed into a perception that the source is credible. And so if you want to be maximally persuasive under most conditions, though not all, you should be perceived as highly trustworthy or honest and highly expert or knowledgeable. Mm-hmm. And perceived bias was mostly not discussed or was discussed as a part of perceived trustworthiness. And what my work has done is to say perceived bias is actually something that's different from perceived trustworthiness. And you can see this kind of happening with the influx of fake news with the 2016 election, where people started asking these questions about like, what's the difference between biased news and fake news? And so my research program has tried to tackle that question of what's the difference between perceiving someone as biased and perceiving them as untrustworthy. So we've talked about perceived bias a lot, this skewedness or slant. Perceived trustworthiness is really about honesty. Do I think this person is going to tell me the truth? And a lot of times those things go together. So you talked about Apple, and probably Apple would be willing to lie to you to sell you. I guess I feel bad for calling out Apple specifically, but this is like a general statement. Apple and basically any other company, I'm sure, would probably lie to sell you something, or at least people might have that concern, but they're also probably biased, right? So they're both those things. And that's basically, I think, why they've been lumped together for so long, is when people or entities have a vested interest, they're both. But this is my example that I like to use. There are times when people seem biased, but honest. So you can think about grandparents. We tend to think about grandparents as highly honest people. And yet if you ask them like, oh, how's little Johnny at soccer, their grandchild, they're going to be like, oh, he's the best one. And it's not because they're lying to you. It's like, that's the most true opinion they could say, is like their grandchild is like the best thing that's ever happened to them and to the world, in fact. So that's a case where someone is completely honest and totally, they're their honest opinion is totally biased.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Because I could see where that would really collide. um, Okay, so let me make the 2 points. Let me say them in a different way, make sure I'm following and make it very clear. So bias is a slant, or it's another word for that. It's a
skewedness is one I use.
Yeah, it's a skew, it's a slant, it's preferential for something. An opinion, an entity, a group, whatever. Trustworthiness has to do with the veracity of the statements. And so those two can be convergent or divergent, right? I would think they could collide, right? So in your example of the grandparents, I mean, by any objective measure, their grandkid could be an absolutely terrible soccer player, but their bias is that they're the best in the world just because that's their flesh and blood or whatever, right? There's their relative, etc. And so there's a collision there, right? Or no? Am I making a problem where there isn't one?
Well, I'm not sure, but I'll be clear about something, which is that trustworthiness is all about attempts to be honest. So I'm being honest about my view, but whether that is the truth of the world is completely different.
Say that again. Say that again.
So like, perceived trustworthiness is all about attempts at being truthful about my views. So I'm trying to be honest with you in my communication, but that involves sometimes being honest about my skewed perspective. So an honest but biased communication from a grandparent is like, my grandkid is the best because that is truly how they see the world. And so in their view, that's completely honest because they're just telling you how they see it. And it's totally biased, but it's not reflective of actual truth, which is their grandkid is probably not very good at soccer.
Right. So, okay. So why does that matter? Because if you're wrong, if you're objectively wrong, but you mean you're trying your hardest to say something honestly, right? Why do we care so much about, is this, because really what I'm thinking is that we care about the motivation or the person's how invested they're in something, regardless of whether it's true or not objectively. We just care that they're trying to be true. Why does that matter?
Yeah. So from a persuasion perspective, and I think this gets into the trickiness of like, how do we know what is true? And if I'm trying to convince you of something, maybe I'll like continue to try to convince you that chocolate ice cream is the jam, right? So this is like,
many have tried. Okay, many have tried.
I'm just gonna keep persisting because I feel like that's what grad school treats people, is just like, just keep persisting. So if I'm trying to persuade you that chocolate ice cream is amazing, your inferences about me are probably gonna guide what you think is the truth. Let's say in this scenario that you've never encountered chocolate ice cream, you don't know what it is, and so all you basically have is what you think of me. And what we've known for a long time, for like 60 years, is like, if you think I'm not an expert in chocolate ice cream, so if I've never tried it, but I'm telling you it's amazing, why would you believe that chocolate ice cream is good?
I wouldn't.
But you wouldn't.
Right.
But let's say, I've tried ice cream. In fact, I've had chocolate ice cream many, many times in my life. And you're like, she's definitely a chocolate ice cream expert.
Right.
Okay, well, then you might know, like, is she trying to tell me the truth? And if all of my retirement is in chocolate ice cream stock, I might very well be lying to you about whether chocolate ice cream is good.
Right.
And so that matters. But let's say I'm a highly expert in chocolate ice cream. I have pure motives. I'm just trying to be honest with you. But you know that I've been indoctrinated since I was a child that chocolate is the best thing on the planet. Then you would still have reason to doubt. And so I think that's why each of those matters is actually the negative version. So if someone doesn't have any knowledge, if someone is willing to lie to you, if someone has a bias, you have reason to suspect that whatever they're saying is not true.
So it really is, it's almost not about the content. It really is about perception. It's about attributions we make about another person. It's the valuation we place on motives. I mean, chocolate ice cream could be absolute dog shit, right? But if I trust you and I think you're trying to tell me the truth and you don't have stock in Breyers or Haagen-Dazs or whatever, and you know, you did a 3-year every summer internship in Italy doing gelato, whatever, right? You know what the hell you're talking about with chocolate ice cream. That's all that really matters. It doesn't really matter. Well, in that sense, the truth of it doesn't matter. It just depends. I mean, maybe it does, but in this example, it's just really the person and whether I think they're trying to tell me the truth. Do I think they're trying to screw me over? If I can say no, based on all these other aspects, there's some trustworthiness aspect of it, then I might be willing. I still might have my opinion that chocolate ice cream is fine, but it's not the best. But I could come around to it a little bit more if I was able to keep having those types of interactions, something like that.
Yes, and that's mostly the case, right? Like if you don't have a previously formed opinion about the topic, and if you don't have really clear evidence one way or the other. So if I gave you chocolate ice cream and it was really terrible, you would know, like, then you would know, right? You could use the evidence in front of you. But a lot of times the evidence we get is kind of not clear one way or the other, in which case what we think of the source giving it to us plays a big role.
I'll give you 2 examples. Sushi. I did not like sushi for a very long time. The idea of eating raw food like that just didn't really interest me. I was like, that's kind of gross. Why would I do that? And I knew it was like a popular thing, right? And so there were so many people that would tell me all the time, you got to try this. This is amazing. And I would be like, eh. And people that I had that really liked it, I knew they liked it, and they weren't trying to sell me anything. They weren't trying to persuade me necessarily about it. They just wanted me to enjoy it with them. And it wasn't until I knew some people that had been to like Japan themselves and were like, it's amazing. I had it over there. And here's like one of these really good spots. I'll take you with me and we'll have it together and I'll show you how to do it. And I still didn't like it, right? It took me like 4 times, right? And at some point, I'm just really persistent when I'm like, look, I want to believe, right? I want to know that I get it, but like, I just can't get there. How do I do this? And it's almost like this wanting to want to like it, right? Because I'm like, I know it's good objectively, right? And so then over time, little by little, I sort of grew to like it. I think I started like what everybody starts with, a California roll or something like that, right? And then I started going, now I can eat it, once a week if I really wanted to. I mean, I can say I like it. I felt the same way about avocados and guacamole. I still think it's overrated. I'm not going to pay $19 for a piece of bread and avocado on it, but that also took me a long time. I just didn't care for it. But there was plenty of people that were like, no, my uncle had grew avocados on a farm in, Central America or wherever. And it's just like, okay, but it was that kind of like, for me, and this is where the persuasion thing or the convincing piece of it is some people may be convinced or persuaded based on sometimes the arguments themselves, right? If like, for example, and this is where I think people are just different, right? But if you show me a convincing argument that is different than mine and it's better, I will at least consider it. And I'll say, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. That makes sense. And this person isn't trying to like persuade me into like a cult or something, right? They're literally trying to get at the heart of something, the most accurate we can get at something. Okay, fine. Or if they're an expert, right? All right, they've done a few things. They have a couple degrees. They have 20 years experience or whatever. It doesn't always have to be that way, but for other bigger topics, that could be the case. And so it's interesting because much of what you're saying is like this perceived piece of it, which I don't know what you think about this, but it's so much relying on perception. And we know perceptions are faulty.
Yeah.
And it puzzles me how the perceived elements of things are so tremendous and how we interact with certain ideas and or certain groups and or certain individuals. I don't know if you have any general statements about the perception piece in terms of like, why are we like this as humans? Is it just a discrimination thing? We have to discriminate between one thing or the other. I mean, what it's fascinating, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the perception piece, the perception's everything. And so this is I'll tell you sort of a real world example. So Other folks have done research on vaccine hesitancy, showing if you get Obama to endorse getting a vaccine, that's more persuasive to Democrats. And if you get Trump to endorse a vaccine, that's more persuasive to Republicans. And in fact, that seems to be one of the only sources that's persuasive to Republicans. So in my work, I've replicated that finding, but my question was like, why? What's the source perception that's driving this? Is it about trustworthiness or about bias? And unsurprisingly, it's about bias, right? Because Republicans think that Trump is an unbiased source, but Democrats think that Obama is an unbiased source. But that's shared group membership, and people go, oh, the person who's in my group is the unbiased one. But that's affecting something dramatically important, their vaccine attitudes, and determining whether they might get one or not. So, but again, it's all just, it's just like them, it's just people making sense of the world and deciding who's unbiased. And of course, it's the person who's more like me, which can be kind of self-reinforcing, right?
Yeah, because nobody's like anybody at the individual level, right? Because you're in a certain group, the type of tribalism or the type of groupthink sorts of things. It's like, yeah, sure, there's some similarities. There's definitely things that connect us. Obviously, we wouldn't, by nature, we are groupish, but no one's going to think about something the same way I do, or, and even for people that think about things similar, there's always nuance and variance within that. So I that's always interesting to me, right? Because many of the biggest differences are within group than between group. I think that's a pretty established finding for certain things. So it's like, well, it's not for everything, but we might agree on. So far, we haven't agreed on anything thus far, right? I like coffee ice cream. You like chocolate ice cream. I don't know what your feelings are about shrimp and avocado, but
I would say I had a similar journey with sushi, so we're probably aligned there.
Shrimp, not sushi, not shrimp. Yes, sushi. Yeah. So it is kind of an acquired taste, I guess, and for some folks. But like, let's take one thing that we agree on. Even if we have the general agreement structure of the thing, I'm sure we can find variance in how we look at it or how we approach it or why we believe that way.
Yeah.
Or if it's bigger ideas that we could agree on, again, the very broad aspects, but then have difference on some of the particulars or how certain things are enacted or et cetera. There's things like that. So even with people that quote unquote agree on a topic, you could probably have variance there as well. Okay. So is there anything else you wanted to say about source bias? I know that's the thing that you've written about a lot, or if we covered it all.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about, I don't know, whatever. I could talk about source bias forever, but
that's fascinating. Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about as you were talking is the things so sources can do different things, which I think is pretty interesting. So on the one hand, if you know that someone is objective rather than biased, you might just like accept what they say out of hand. But it can also color your perception of how good their arguments are. So if someone gives you arguments that are like kind of actually could be seen as good or bad, if you know that they are more objective than biased in your view, you are actually going to see those arguments as stronger compared to somebody, if the same argument coming from someone that you think is biased.
Yeah.
I haven't shown this with bias, but for other characteristics, source characteristics, and I think this happens with bias, I just haven't shown it yet, but source characteristics can influence the amount that you process an argument. So they can affect whether you actually think about a particular thing or you just go, oh, that person's talking whatever, and you don't actually think about it. So source perceptions are actually kind of diverse in what they can do. They can affect whether you think about something, they can affect how strong you see the evidence for something. And I think that's kind of interesting in the context of what you're saying about you and I might be a part of a group that shares overall similar views, but if you say something that is actually maybe disagreement in some sense, I might receive it, I might attend to the message more or see the message as stronger from you compared to an out-group member.
Because it's someone that's from within, right? It's someone that's very similar. Yeah. I can definitely see that. I did remember one thing I was going to ask you. So maybe again, you tell me how much you want to get into it or not, but as an example, because this is something that you mentioned it earlier, but this is something that I hear a lot from people, and I've tried to make this argument and it never goes anywhere. I have I have friends all across the spectrum in the aisle, right? I have, people that voted for Trump. I have Republican friends. I obviously have many liberal friends and progressives and everywhere in between. And I know that there are certain friends of mine on the right. If I send them an article to read about whatever, and it's from the New York Times, full stop. Oh, I'm not going to read that bias bullshit. Blah, 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 blah. Just not even going to open it. Not even going to click on the link. Not even going to open it. Nothing. Washington Post, LA Times, even sometimes the Wall Street Journal, right? They'll just be like, oh, I'm not reading that, liberal left garbage, blah, 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 super biased. That's the thing I will hear. I will hear that all the time. And if I push back on it and I'll say, well, what do you mean it's biased? Oh, come on, man. They're just trying to sell some type of, ideology, or they're trying to sell some kind of propaganda, or, it's just whatever they want you to think. And, it's not real investigative journalism. It's not neutral. It's all of these things. I feel like this happens a lot with media, right? But I think that goes back to the thing that you were saying earlier, right? Is the difference between opinions, bias, and the trustworthiness piece of it, right? Yeah. So you could have a bias, but that doesn't mean that you're not trying to find the most accurate answer either, though, right? So in terms of, I guess, mass media is what you could call it, with, whether it's on, certain television stations or newspapers or publications or et cetera. Because that is a kind of trustworthiness, and then also how we understand some of these as institutions, right? Of how we get information. I don't know if you want to say anything about that specifically, or.
Yeah, I can go. I'll go two directions with it. Sorry, you figured out now that my brain is constantly branching.
No, that's great. No, it's great.
So one is, and maybe you're thinking of this. At some point, there was a graphic going around that sort of like arranged news sources on sort of a figure, where the x-axis or the bottom was how biased they were, liberal to conservative, and the y-axis or the vertical piece was how truthful they were. And so there were sort of news organizations organized by bias and trustworthiness, which I thought was interesting. So I think people do think about news organizations as varying along both of these dimensions. And probably most people, though of course not everyone, thinks about like NPR as kind of like the closest you could get to least biased, most truthful. I know not everyone sees NPR that way, but I think a lot of people do. And then you sort of have like Fox and MSNBC going on opposite ideological ends. And then you sort of have things like Breitbart, where it doesn't even seem like they're trying to be truthful. So yes, and I think people do think about them in this way. And I think what you're talking about is a really good example of just like dismissing, like not even considering an argument from a source that you think is biased. So you just dismiss it completely out of hand. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think again, it just depends on the person, right? I mean, I think that there are some people, for example, if they, again, my example, if, I send them a New York Times article, they're not even going to open it because they just think it's completely biased and it's garbage. And my argument, my pushback to that sometimes is like, look, I would say probably 75 to 90% of the New York Times op-ed, I'm not reading. I just don't like it personally. But everything else, I don't see. I mean, sure, it leans left, but they are striving to try and report news. Do they get it wrong? Are some things not as, neutral as other ones? Yes. But overall, they're just reporting what's going on in the world, right?
Right.
I don't feel that way about the Huffington Post. It's just I'm terribly biased. I am less likely to open a Huffington Post article myself now. I think when it came online 10, 15 years ago, whatever, I probably would have. But, that's fine. I do if people send it to me, and I'll be nice and I'll look at it and okay, whatever. But again, that's a little bit more of like, I think there's a distinction sometimes between like, okay, I know there's a bias and I don't care. Like, it doesn't bother me. Mm-hmm. My concern is, well, can I trust that they were trying to do their best to get at the information most accurately? Do I think Breitbart and Infowars are going to do that? Probably not. Do I think Huffington Post or BuzzFeed are going to do that? Probably not. But Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, I think they're still trying to do that. Or at least they have a bias. That's fine. But they're at least trying. I think Wall Street Journal, they have a bias. I mean, historically, they're right or center right. But they're trying to get at the truth of things from their lens. And so I think your point's instructive here, because it's having bias doesn't mean it's bullshit or it's garbage, right? You could still try to get, kind of with the grandparent example you were giving, you can still try to be pushing for the truth. You may get it wrong, but it doesn't mean you just throw it all out. I don't know. What do you
think? And it suggests kind of a different strategy. So if you think if you think a particular news institution is trying to be truthful, but you think they have perhaps a liberal bias, you can have a strategy where you have your institution on the left and you have an institution on the right. And if you think they're both trying to be truthful, then you as a consumer, if you can read something from each of them, then you can feel pretty confident, like, especially if they agree, the places where those places, then you could be like, that seems like pretty good truth. But like, then you can at least, if you're reading both of them, you feel like you can get at least kind of a balanced information search and at least see like two institutions coming from different perspectives, but trying to be truthful. You can at least evaluate that. So you can, in some senses, try to correct for sources bias by seeking out another source with a different bias.
Yeah.
You can't do that for untrustworthiness. If someone's lying to you, it's not helpful, or if they don't care about the truth, it's not helpful to go seek out another source who also doesn't care about the truth. That's like a waste of time, right? Where you don't always need one objective source, because you can try to cope with source bias by seeking out other sources with different biases.
Yeah, no, that's right. And some of in terms of journalism, the arguments I've made from the brief or cursory kind of stuff I've read on the history of journalism in the United States, things were more biased during the 19th century and early 20th century. I mean, you literally would have whole newspapers in a town or city, and they would just write for people that read them. They didn't care about trying to even feign neutrality or objectivity. It was hyper partisan. During Lincoln's time, during even all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt's time. I mean, you would have these papers, and they would just have like smear campaigns against people they hated. I mean, it was real vicious stuff. I mean, it's not everyone likes to think that the time they live in is so unique, and it is in one way in terms of maybe the medium, sure, but all that tells me is humans are just kind of the same over time. But everyone's just like, the media is so biased. It's like that's not a critique for me. Right? I think your point is right. If you can find relatively reasonable sources that are a right or left bias in this scenario, and they're kind of sort of saying the same thing, well, there you go, right? You would kind of want that. You would want there to be some kind of balance to trying to get at as close as you can the accuracy of something. So
yeah. So the other branch I was going to go is It's interesting to see how sources cope with knowing they might be perceived as biased. So I think in 2017, the New York Times had this new social media policy where they required, if their reporters were going to post on social media, they couldn't just link to one side of the issue. They had to link to multiple perspectives. And the specific concern the New York Times had is they were concerned they were going to be perceived as biased, and they were concerned that would undercut the credibility of their newsroom. And I was like, oh, you're totally right. Like, you should be concerned about bias, and you should be concerned about that making you seem less credible. And I have work that's soon to be under review showing so the question was if you acknowledge another side versus only present your own side, does that make you seem less biased? And the answer is yes, with a caveat. So yes, it does for topics that people think are kind of neutral topics, or novel topics, things they don't know a lot about. And how do news sources cope with perceived bias? And in addition to concerns about the media being too polarized, sometimes people have concerns about both sidesism, about the media trying to have a more balanced narratives than is supported by the facts. And so I think what's interesting, what I think is interesting about that work, or that I think is important, is it seems like the best thing to do is just be truthful. And sometimes that won't always be popular, but if there is mixed information, it's useful to acknowledge the mixedness. Mm-hmm. If the information is skewed, it's useful to present a skewed perspective and not try to do some kind of false balancing act, is kind of how I see the message there.
Yeah. I could hear when you were saying that. I was like, oh, it's gonna be that both sides thing, and people hate that. They hate that stuff now, and that's fine. I mean, I think what people hate it because it disrupts, I think, their notions about things, or how strongly they feel about something. But I think what it shows is that, and you don't necessarily do that with everything, right? So I would agree. Something like, rape, or incest, or killing children, or the worst things you can imagine. Yes, there's no both sides in that, right? I mean, but I think that for a lot of other things, less perverse, people will say like, "Oh, you're just both sidesing it. You're making this. You're trying to minimize how serious this other side is. We have to have a villain. We have to have, this is all terrible, right? And this side is not, or very much less so." And I think the more for people that do research, if they're doing it honestly, and everyone else in the world, right, that's doing things, you realize that life's super complicated. Things are really nuanced. There's a lot of variables in play, and almost you cannot try to make things so reductionistic or absolute. It just doesn't work. It starts to fall apart. Anytime, here's my bias. Anytime somebody tries to do that, my antenna go up. It's like, oh boy, here we go. Here we go. Trying to say, like, well, this is all it is. Boom. We just drill all the way down to these 2 points. And it's like, oh man. Yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult to kind of just say that. I mean, I get sometimes what people are doing. They're trying to simplify things and all that. I understand that. But I think sometimes people will just want maybe their intentions are good, but it's not that easy. Especially for complicated problems, really complicated problems with multiple people involved. It's hard to really just nail it down to like a thing or two things or something like that.
I think the world would be a better place if we all had a lot more tolerance for ambiguity and ambivalence.
Yes.
But I also do think there's times when I think being straightforward about the distribution of information can only be a good thing for mass media to do. Is sort of how I feel about it.
I would agree. And I think if people did that, you would have more robust and more dynamic conversations about things, even online, right? Instead of seeing the, 90-second clip of fill in the blank, or, the very small article that just, feeds your priors and just says, yes, see, I knew it, and just confirms all of the biases I've already had. If more people were presenting things in a more mixed way, right? Not to be confusing, but to just say like, well, there's this going on and this is happening, but then there's also these things going on, this happening, and all right, go ahead, fight about it, figure it out, because we don't know. I think more people would probably be more like, damn, that is really tough. There's a lot going on there, as opposed to like the one piece or the one thing they see or whatever, and it's like, boom, see, confirms it. I know it. Just another thing. I see this literally happen all day on Twitter. It's like, oh no.
Yep.
So, what are you going to do? Okay, so let's get into the next topic I think that you've written about is attitudes, and what are the attitudinal distributions and attributions we make, and how this impacts how we know things about certain topics and attractability and morality. So kind of, give us the overview of what your research has looked at with attitudes, how you define attitudes, and then some of the particulars of where it kind of.
Yeah. So in my perceived bias work, we were talking a lot about attitude change. So how do you change your minds, and how do sources influence that? The other big question that attitude researchers have is when do attitudes predict behavior and other relevant outcomes, as well as like when do attitudes persist over time? So those are the big questions for attitude researchers. And it's interesting, like attitudes don't always predict behavior. So
how would you define attitude, I guess, first?
Okay, good. That's a good start.
Well, how do you define it, but also not in a vacuum, right? So we've talked about bias, we've talked about opinions, we've talked about perception, so how do you define attitude? And then maybe how do you define it as separate or different from all those other things?
Yeah. Okay. Really good question. I think about attitude and opinion as basically synonymous. I've heard other people give a little bit of a broader definition of attitudes, but I specifically think of attitudes as how good or bad you think something is. So chocolate ice cream, really good. Sushi, pretty good. Rainy days, kind of bad. Incest, super bad. Those are a list of attitudes that I have. So, and then you can have. So I basically think that's the same as opinions. And then within those attitudes, I can have different beliefs, right? So chocolate ice cream is super tasty. Rainy days make me feel sleepy. Mm-hmm. Those are my specific beliefs underlying my attitude, which is just my overall summary evaluation.
Could you say that attitudes are more... I mean, I've not thought about the definition of attitudes. That's why I talk to social psychologists, because they tell me. But my intuition says that attitude, as different from opinion, is more of style or temperament of sorts, right? Like you can have. See, now I'm not going to be able to explain the difference. Like you could have an opinion about something, right? I think that chocolate ice cream is okay. It's just fine. I mean, I would probably do mint chocolate chip or butter pecan before I do chocolate ice cream by itself.
Oh, butter pecan, that's harsh.
I know. I'm sorry. I know. But really what that is on the individual level, it's just a projective of my style and my preferences. But that's an opinion, right? But the attitude is kind of like the style in which you have an opinion. I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to explain this. I do see it as a little bit more generalized and maybe different, but I don't know. Maybe you want to fight with me about that. I don't know.
I'm not sure quite what you're getting at, but it is making me think of something we call attitude strength, which I would think about as a style of having an attitude.
Okay.
Are you interested in
yes,
talking about that? Okay.
Yes. Okay. So if it confirms my bias.
So we think about attitudes as varying in strength. So when we talk about strong attitudes, those are attitudes that predict relevant outcomes, so they're impactful and are durable. So they resist attempts at persuasion and they persist over time. So my chocolate ice cream attitude is very strong because I go down the street to Jenny's and get dark chocolate ice cream from her all of the time.
Oh, you get dark chocolate. You don't just get chocolate, right? You get dark chocolate. Okay, so
you get the dark chocolate.
More specific. Okay.
Your chocolate ice cream attitude is also strong because it has resisted my persuasion attempts and seems to have persisted. Both of ours seem to have persisted for quite a long time.
That's right, yeah.
So those are examples of strong attitudes. We know attitudes are strong when people are very confident in them, when they see them as moral issues, when they view the relevant issue as relatively univalent, having one side rather than ambivalent and being more mixed, when they have a lot of knowledge about it. And so those kind of features of attitudes or opinions can ultimately influence what those attitudes do. But I think of those as kind of different styles of having opinions. Is I can have an opinion that's filled with confidence, or I can have an opinion that's filled with doubt. I can have a really univalent reaction to something, or I can feel really conflicted and mixed. So I don't know if that's what you had in mind when you were talking about styles of opinions, but that's what came to mind for me.
I am very convinced by your answer. So you have persuaded me, you see.
Okay.
You see how this works, you see. Yeah, no, that's more of what I'm saying. Yeah. And so yes, attitude strength, and then yes, about opinion strength. The way you explain it that way, it makes sense. So yeah, it's a W for you.
Okay, good.
Okay. Before I said that, you were talking about attitudes and opinions, and then what was the other thing that was said? You said attitudes and opinions are synonymous, and then there was the other thing that you said after that.
We were talking about, you asked about the difference between perceived bias and or biases and opinions, which we talked about a little bit before. So opinions are definitely, or at least can be directional, but they don't have to be biased. So as we've already discussed, it's a clear fact that chocolate ice cream is amazing, and you're just biased on that one, but I'm not.
Okay, can I really just completely throw a wrench in the works here?
Yep.
So I enjoy chocolate ice cream if there's peanut butter involved or some type of or some type of nut. So it could be a walnut, almonds, pecans, whatever. If there's some type of nut in there, I will eat chocolate ice cream. But I cannot eat chocolate ice cream by itself. I mean, I can, but I'm not going to really enjoy it. I'm not going to be repulsed and disgusted by it, but I'm going to be like, not really interested. But if it has peanut butter in it, or if it has any type of nut in it, all day. It's like brownies. I won't eat brownies, but if they have nuts in them, I'll eat the whole bucket.
So you seem to have a highly favorable attitude towards nuts then.
Yes, nuts, because that's the thing that I can override my chocolate disdain if the nuts and or peanut butter is there.
So you seem to be like very certain in your nut opinion.
Yes.
Have a lot of confidence.
Yes,
so
a lot of confidence, a lot of certainty.
Your nut attitude predicts your behavior.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So in terms of attitudes, right? Like, and or opinions, right? So I have a strong opinion. And the only reason I have a strong opinion is because, see, this is the thing where it's interesting, right? Like, I have a strong opinion about chocolate for myself, but I don't have that strong opinion for other people. Like, you can love chocolate ice cream. I'm like, oh, it's great. I'm happy. I'm really happy for you. And I can tell that the joy you get from talking about this is the same joy I get when I talk about coffee ice cream or whatever. So then I don't even have to do that work, but I can say, okay, fine. So, but I know that for some people, they will have very strong opinions or strong attitudes where they will be like, I believe this way and you must believe this way, or you should believe this way, because if you don't, then you're a moron or whatever it is, right? And so in terms of attitudes, right? Like how do our attitudes or opinions change or impact all the things like as you talked about morality or other topics?
Yeah, so I guess two things. One is I have been thinking lately about, and I guess I don't think these ideas are new at all, but I've been thinking about attitude orientations that are useful for receptiveness, which meaning sort of like being open to differing views, consuming information, and attitudes that are useful for action. And again, this is similar to what I was saying about judges and prosecutors, in the sense that I think there are people who have different kinds of roles in society that require different things. So there are some people in society whose job is to be open and receptive and learn new things. And there are some people in society whose job is to take action. So activists, their job is to push for change. So you want those people to be highly certain in their attitudes, and not only certain for themselves, but we actually talk about certainty as having two facets: clarity and correctness. So clarity is all about, what do I think? So I'm very clear that I love chocolate ice cream. Correctness is everybody should think this. And I'm actually a high clarity but low correctness on my chocolate attitude. So I'm okay if you like coffee ice cream, and I can understand your perspective. But in general, correctness especially, but certainty generally, is useful for action. So activists tend to be highly certain in their attitudes, but doubt and ambivalence is useful for receptiveness, for being open to differing views and trying to see different perspectives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. This is interesting. So, so how people will have these ideas or these notions that you must think strongly about particular issues. And if you don't, you're not fully engaged, or you're not fully on my team, or you're not fully committed to it. And people will get sometimes not very upset, but they'll get annoyed if you don't, right? So a lot of the times, I joke that people like to pick on centrists and moderates because they just feel like they're always in the middle on everything, right? Because it's like, well, I don't know what side you're on. You're always both sides in it, and you're always just kind of being like, well, one side, a little bit from this side and a little bit from this side, and those people get really upset, right? People on either side will get, you need to be on a team. You can't be in this like neutral space. And so in terms of the certainty thing, is it, this is an opinion and a value, so I'm not trying to make it that way, but is it important, do you think? I think you were giving an example with like the judges and stuff, but is it important that we have people that have strong opinions and they act on them, and then other people that don't do that, and they're less interested, and maybe they're more apathetic or whatever, or based on the data or the research about these things, what can you say about these types of groups that operate differently?
Yeah, so I don't know if I can speak based on data, but I can speak on my opinion, which is like, yeah, I think basically that's how society functions, and we kind of need both those people. And so I don't think anything would ever change. I don't think society would get better if we didn't have people passionately advocating for things.
Yeah.
But a job of an advocate is to present things as kind of one-sided, to push things as forward as they can, and to not, activists can be pie in the sky, what is the ideal world that we want to be, but then you need people, policymakers, who are figuring out like practically, how do we do this, and how do we weigh the concerns of lots of different constituencies here, not just these people who are pushing really hard. And so I think there are different kinds of or like, I think academics kind of work this way too, where like, if your job is to think, it requires you to consider different perspectives and be open. And I think when academics start becoming very certain about things, they should be in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's not, I think society doesn't improve unless you also have this group of people who are very certain, pushing for something. But you also need moderating forces.
So kind of similar with that, what is the need or the place for persuasion, right? Like, do we, this kind of goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, but if we have our certain perceptions of things, how do we, I guess, fairly, how do we try to say, should we persuade people, or should there just be some people who are like, well, look, let them think what they want, let them do what they want, not that they're a lost cause, but like, there's no point in doing that, right? You're never going to persuade me that chocolate ice cream is far superior, and that's just how it's going to be. Is that a helpful thing to say, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer to that question. I do think, so some of my work has looked at morally based attitudes. And I think when people view their attitudes as based in their morals, they feel like it is a responsibility of theirs to persuade others. And I think there's a function there. It's allowing people to express their values. It's also like allowing them to push for a society that they want to see. But I have a hard time weighing in on like whether that is a good or bad thing.
But based on the research though that you've done, is that morals usually push or people towards persuading people of what their positions are and what their beliefs are, or moral beliefs are, right? So people don't have them in isolation. They don't have them in a vacuum, right? If I believe killing is wrong, then I'm going to try and persuade everyone that killing is wrong, right? That's usually how it works.
Yep.
Rarely do people have morals and they're not trying to also persuade or influence them on someone else.
That is generally, I don't know if it's rarely, but I would say compared to non-moral attitudes, people are much more likely to try to persuade about moral issues than non-moral issues. Is
there a religious component to that? Because obviously many times religions in general have a moral component, not always, but or is it separated from religious belief systems?
So in my work, I'm sort of agnostic to what people think of as moral. So like some people think chocolate chip cookies are moral, and most people don't. And there are some topics that are normatively more moral than others. So, things like gun control, abortion, those things tend to be more moralized than issues like chocolate chip cookies. Right. But people also vary in whether those topics are moral issues for them. And religion's kind of the same, where some people think of belief in God as a moral issue, and if you don't agree with me, you're going to hell. And other people, it's not a moral issue for them. It's sort of like, this is what I believe, but you don't have to, and it's not inherently good or bad.
Yeah. And so, again, based on your research, what else can you tell us about attitude strength and attitudes in general, about how they impact certain things, or anything else you want to share on this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some of our work that I think is relevant to the world at large has looked at attraction to others. And when I say attraction to others, I don't really mean dating, although relevant too, but I'm using attraction in a much broader sense of just like you meet somebody and they tell you your opinion. So our work has shown that people tend to like other people who like the same things that they do, but that tends to especially be the case for people who have strong attitudes. So who have moral opinions, or who have hold their opinions with high certainty, or low ambivalence. So this is related to what I was saying about the like openness versus action kind of outcomes, where people who don't have such strong opinions are more open to people who disagree with them, whereas people who have these really strong attitudes are people who tend to be like, yeah, I'm good just hanging out with people who agree with me. We haven't shown this, but I think a downstream consequence of that is like kind of reinforcing beliefs. So if I'm like, I am highly certain of my chocolate ice cream attitude, it might make me be like, you know, I'm good if I only hang out with other chocolate ice cream people. And then we are just constantly talking about how great chocolate ice cream is. And all of a sudden we have this cluster where we're all agreeing chocolate ice cream is the best. And that is reinforcing how certain we are in our opinions and making it harder for us to be open to differing opinions.
So it's a type of echo chamber, essentially.
Yeah, it's one way there are many ways echo chambers happen, but one way is, I think, people create them themselves by choosing to be around other people who think what they do. And it's worse if you start from a place of strength and then other people reinforce what you already believe, which just makes you stronger in what you believe.
And is that something that we're looking for, or something that we tend to, in terms of the attractability, right? So what are the things that you kind of look for to kind of gravitate towards individuals? Is it, you like hiking, I like hiking. Yeah, so we're both going to hang out, that kind of thing. Or if it's like, I don't really care about that, but, we'll hang out, but I'm going to be less interested in trying to foster that if we don't have, some affinities or similarities, with certain tasks.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is about wanting to make sense of the world. So we like other people who like the same things we do because it makes us feel validated. Mm-hmm. And so if I get to be friends with other people who like the same things I do, I get to feel more confident that those are good things to like. And that makes me feel good, in addition to having things in common with those people to talk about.
So it's interesting because I always think that the best thing that we can do is the opposite of that, which just sounds like it's literally antithetical to what we would normally do or instinctively do. But I think we grow and we become better people. It's not to say you can't grow or become a good person with someone that has similar interests, but I think as we broaden ourselves, we broaden our horizons, we see certain things, and we have less of a kind of homogenized kind of group, or in terms of interest or whatever else, we are able to be more well-rounded and multifaceted and in various ways. And you could look at this in many different aspects. But it sounds like, that we're walking up the mountain backwards, right? It's going against everything that we would instinctively do, right? Is what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think for non-moral issues, for issues that you're doubtful of, this is less likely to happen. But I do think people probably vary in how much they like to have other people around them reinforcing their views. So people who really don't like ambiguity, who don't like to feel ambivalent, those people are probably like, yeah, bring on everyone who thinks like me. And there are probably other people, and I'm guessing you're probably one of them, who's higher in tolerance for ambiguity, and you feel more comfortable if you're considering different perspectives and it's not so aversive to you. And in fact, like, I think there are probably people who actively seek that out because it's a way of being intellectually humble. It's a different way of feeling validated in what you know and what you believe by considering different perspectives, right?
Yeah. So it will come no surprise that I'm consistently high on openness to experience. That's definitely I'm very high on that. Yeah. I mean, I think the whole reason that I'm doing what I'm doing at the moment, right? With the podcast and different conversations is just that, right? Part of it is, I wanted to create and put something out into the world, right? I like to write. I'm an okay writer. It just takes me so long and I get frustrated and just like, I can just talk it out better. But I got tired of just consuming information, and I kind of wanted to create something and put it back into the world for other people as well, for myself, but for other people. And I have at various moments become very frustrated because there's a lot of things you have to kind of, not purposefully, but you just have to kind of be aware of it. It's easy to kind of get a little bit in a whirlpool, right? Same topics, right? You get a lot of reinforcement. People will, listen or ask for or comment or whatever on like the 3 same topics we're talking about in society, right? Everyone knows what these topics are. And so it's very easy to kind of just get stuck on that because, people just kind of reinforce it. And so I've had to fight against that. I mean, I like talking about race. It's interesting, but I don't want to talk about it every other week. I just don't. And then also in terms of that is looking to be like, well, I want to find different, have conversations with different people that think differently than me. I mean, I can most certainly find people that think similarly to me, kind of what you're saying, right? I'm going to say, oh, we see this the same, or we have something. Oh, that's cool. And then we kind of rap about it. That's great. Cool. And then it's like, well, I'm not being pushed. My ideas aren't getting put in the gym, right? I need to get them worked out. I need to make sure like, okay, where am I missing this? And so I think healthy disagreement is really important in that way. And so some people will ask me like, do you look for people to come on so you can debate them? It's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I want to have a conversation. I want to have a dialogue. If we have a point of disagreement, I want to understand it and see where it is and why, and see what that is. But you're not going to change my mind on chocolate ice cream. But I would be, even though I have a pretty strong opinion about it, again, that's just tastes. Really, it's really all it is. I didn't decide that this was how I am. Okay, this is just how I am. It's my taste.
It's literally taste.
What can I say? Okay, this wasn't volitional. But if you said, hey, look, you know what? We're going to hang out and I'm going to bring you the best chocolate ice cream and I want you to try it. And I want you to just tell me what you think. I would do it. I would totally do it. Even if I'm like, well, not really into it. And I would try in that moment to see, okay, let me just take this very purely. I know it's chocolate. I know I don't really like that, but you know what? Clean slate it. Like it's the first time. And then you might be surprised. That's kind of how I am. I get that a lot of people aren't that way. That's fine. There's other people that are that way. That's fine. So I think in having conversations though is trying to do just that. It's like, well, how do you have other people? I didn't want to just get a bunch of progressive lefties. I didn't want to get just a bunch of, ex-lefties or just conservatives. It's all over the place, right? All over the map, and tend to see where we're at. Because my point on that is that there's more, because of the human nature, of just who we are, that we have more in common than we realize because of our humanity. And we can have opinions and attitudes and beliefs and all these biases, but there are many things that connect us as humans. And so it's just interesting to find out about that.
So some of what I'm doing right now has to do with, so we talked about how people infer bias from message-sidedness. Some of the work I'm doing now is how people infer bias from expressions of confidence. So this is related to attitude strength in the sense that, you know, people express like, I'm very sure of my opinion about this thing, or I think this, but I'm not totally sure. And so I was interested in so backing up a little bit, if we think about, there are some news sources, for example, that we think have biases or not. But there's lots of times that we just like hear someone on the radio or we meet someone for the first time and we have to figure out like, is this person biased on this issue or not? And so like, how do we go about doing that is a question that's interesting to me. And there's a lot of work suggesting people are more persuasive when they say like, I'm very confident about this thing. But what we've shown is there's actually a negative consequence, which is people perceive others as more biased when they're highly confident. What's interesting is they also seem to be more honest. So that's an interesting, or they seem more honest when they seem confident. So there's these trade-offs that come with expressing a lot of confidence.
So let me get this right. If I express confidence in the fact that light roast coffee from Central America is the best coffee, that's very specific, right? But what was it? So people are less likely to believe that. What was it? And then if it was, they'll see it as me being honest, right? But what was the other inverse? What was it?
But biased.
Yes. And so if I'm more like, I don't know, I'd have to consider it. I have to see other things. I have to try, less confident. What does that indicate again?
People see you as, okay, hold on. Let me do this. So if you're doubtful, if you express doubt, you're less biased, but also you seem less honest. But if you're more confident, people see you as highly honest, but also highly biased. So there are these trade-offs in how people see you when you express confidence versus doubt.
That's interesting. Because it doesn't seem that people really, in some scenarios, don't care about the honesty of it. Right? If I'm exercising, or if I'm showing to you, if I'm signaling to you that I have some epistemic humility here, right? I don't know confidently. Well, maybe I'm just not being honest. But that would be, in terms of the lack of, I don't say overconfidence, but strong opinions, that would seem like something that somebody would want, right? If I said, look, again, I guess this also depends too on like the content of it, right? If I say, look, I know the earth is flat, like I just know, and I strongly believe it, that's a little bit different than the best light roast coffee is from Central America. That's a little bit more subjective, right? So how does it map onto, I guess, the content of it? I guess that would probably be more salient there, I would imagine.
Okay, so I think the earth is flat thing is getting at two things. One is, so I haven't tested this, but I suspect this all works, like the sidedness stuff, where like when people are really confident about things, opinions that are like one-sided and agreed upon by most people are probably like, yeah, that you're unbiased and truthful. So like, if you're like, I'm just so sure the earth's flat, people are probably like, you're unbiased. But if you're like, I'm so confident that whatever, we should all eat pizza for dinner every night, people are probably like, okay, that seems like a biased stance compared to someone who's like, I don't know, but it seems like a good idea for us to eat pizza for dinner every night. So there's vary in fact and subjectivity, but there are like facts that are not widely agreed upon in direction, right? So like right now, whether masks prevent the spread of COVID is a topic of discussion in society. And
it's a discussion. It's a topic of rage for people.
It's a topic of varying perspectives.
And various emotions too.
Yeah. And yeah, it's an affective and cognitively
fucked situation. Yeah.
Yeah, but like that is one that's like you could have like an empirically based thing where you would say like I think masks do prevent. I'm like very confident that masks prevent the spread of COVID, and especially probably people who disagree with you are going to be like, I think you're biased compared to somebody who says like, I'm not 100% sure, but I do think masks help spread or prevent the spread of COVID.
So there's 2 points I have on that, or 2 questions, I should say. And we can use the mask if you want as an example. One is if it seems intuitively true that someone can kind of understand it, even if they want to still resist it, they can kind of know. Like, if you follow the logic here, if we agree that COVID is at a bare minimum, in some way, has airborne transmission, right? I have the virus, I'm breathing through my nostrils or my mouth, I cough, it's going to be released, and it's going to be in the air. If we're sharing the same, very confined airspace, it's going to be in the air, it's going to be, you're going to inhale, etc. You have to kind of agree on the transmission of it. I think most people, let's leave out the people that don't believe it actually exists. Let's just say the people that actually say, yeah, it's a thing, it's a real thing, whatever. Okay, that's how it's transmitted. Kind of like the flu is too. Of course, flu is 1-to-1. I think COVID's 1-to-3, whatever. So it's more contagious, obviously, but okay. Intuitively, you would say, if you put a sock over your face, it's not less particles are going to get out than if you didn't have that, because there's something obstructing your airflow and it's catching particles that you don't see. All right. In this scenario, the socially acceptable garment for our face is a mask. Right? It's literally to catch particles from an airborne virus. Now, that intuitively makes sense. I don't need to have a PhD in epidemiology and virology and immunology to know airborne, yep, comes out, yep, okay. We should probably put something over our face where it's coming out to say, yeah, let's catch as many particles as we can. It still could be put in the air, but it's going to be less likely than not. Now, if that's the intuition, people could be still obstinate, resistant. They make all the claims about my personal liberty, et cetera, et cetera. But is that different than something a little bit more complicated or difficult, such as, well, I don't know this, and I have to trust an expert to tell me. I can't intuit this idea. So you could probably say this a little bit probably with vaccines. Okay. But we don't have to go into the vaccine thing. I'm just saying in terms of the mask thing, is it the fact that people are more likely that they can believe it because of there's some intuition around it, right? They still might not like it. They still might say it overrides their personal responsibility or their individuality and their liberties. They could say that it's ridiculous that we have to do this outside, whatever. But there's some intuition there. Is that an easier thing than well, I have to believe the trustworthiness of an expert that says I have to do it? Is there some kind of difference there, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. The example I thought about when you said that is climate change, which does feel very hard to have intuitions about. Even with vaccines, you could think like, okay, it kind of makes sense that if you tell my body this is a threat, that then it would know how to defend itself against a threat later. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know of any research on this, but I kind of share your intuition that I guess two parts. The more that you can make a scientific thing like something that's easily graspable, the more people can will be able to generate their own thoughts about it. So that's a really important part of persuasion. Is it actually doesn't matter what people remember about what you say, it's the thoughts they generate about it. And so if you can get people to generate thoughts like, yeah, it makes sense that you would want something covering your mouth to prevent the spread of particles, that would be great. I've never been so grateful we're not all walking around with socks on our head. But I guess it's interesting because I'm not even sure that people are thinking that when they're opposed to masks.
Yeah.
I think probably the thoughts that they're generating are like, this is uncomfortable, this makes me feel vulnerable or silly in a way that I don't like, and it makes me feel like my freedoms are violated. And so I think they are probably really focused on those parts of it. And people are very good at dissonance reduction. So when we talk about cognitive dissonance, we mean that people don't like to hold conflicting views or to behave inconsistently with what they view. And so I think when people want to be opposed to masks for all the reasons I said, it's also very easy for them to go, and COVID's not a very big threat, and masks probably aren't that effective. So like this is the same kind of thing with climate change, where when people want to oppose climate change, they're, for whatever reason, they're also very good at convincing themselves that it's not a threat. And so people will shift whether they think something is a threat depending on how much they like the solution to it, if that makes sense.
Yes. I also think it depends on how much they know is the solution or how well it's been explained.
Yep.
In a way that is, tangible. But there's my position on this. You tell me what you think about this. Is people don't like feeling dumb. They don't like that. I mean, no one likes that. I don't like feeling dumb. I'm sure most people don't like feeling something that I don't know. You couple that with, well, we have experts, we have the government, we have institutions that are telling us you're wrong, not like that, but or this is how you do it. Doing it in another way isn't correct. It's like double layered. It's well, I'm being told I'm doing something wrong, or that I don't know something. I have it wrong. And then this other person has the answer and I don't, and they're in an authority position, and I don't like that. And so it's a lot of resistance. Like you could say the same thing if for example, I live out in the Midwest and I don't believe in climate change. I'm just using it as an example. And someone from the government or an expert, climate scientist or whatever tells me this and all this stuff, and I don't like that, or I feel negative on how that's being perceived. Let's say the same things were said, but it was from their neighbor or it was somebody from across the town, and that was telling them, hey man, this is a big deal. This is a big problem. Oh, really? Yeah, let me tell you why. Boom, 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 boom. Oh, I would imagine they're more likely to be. So my theory on this stuff is, kind of with masks and with vaccines and all these things is the lethality of it or just getting sick isn't enough, is what we've learned. That people have, kind of, you're saying, ways in which they will correct for that. They'll get around the cognitive dissonance there. And I think how I see this is that they don't want to be told that they don't know something. And when there's, I think, some sense this type of inferiority. There's an insecurity there. I don't like being told I don't know something. It's like, oh man, especially if I should know it, or I feel like I should know it, or something like that. And so, I mean, for example, if we were having the same problem with like Ebola, I don't think this would be a problem. You're bleeding out of your eyes in some cases with Ebola, right? Everyone would be like, yeah, this is a big deal. Like, I'm going to listen to what the scientists say. It could have been made in a lab. It could not have been made in a lab. The vaccine could be pumping me with all this other garbage. I don't care. I'm not getting Ebola. There's no way I want to get Ebola. I do not want to get sick. It's got a lot of GI issues. There's sometimes the external bleeding. No one wants that. So sometimes I think it's the nature of what the threat is. And so I think, so there's just all these combining variables, but I don't know what you think about that in terms of like, people don't like being wrong. They don't like not knowing. They don't like being, when you're in those positions, you're in a vulnerable position because it's like, well, I'm kind of dumb. I didn't know that. Now that's not true, but that can feel that way. And so then it's like, you know what? Fuck you. You're not going to tell me this and this and this and this and this and this. No, I'm not wearing your mask. No, I'm not going to be doing all these things. And then that's the arguments of, my liberties and all these things and all that stuff. And so even if really wise people are trying to say, like, look, this is all it is. It's something to put over your face to prevent particles. That's all it is. This isn't trying to control you. It's not trying to this, or this. People will double down. It's very hard for people to, at that point, change, because I think that the personal psychology of it is, internally or intrinsically, it's, I don't know something, and I don't like that feeling. And then they're telling me that they know more than me. And it is a kind of, what's the thing that people always say about experts or people in government or even certain parties? It's this sanctimonious, looking down, condescending. People don't like, even if that's not true, if it's the perception of it.
Yeah.
Full stop. They're not going to hear anything you have to say. Nothing. So I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts or you want to say anything about that in general, but.
Yeah, it makes me think about source perceptions in general. Mm-hmm. It makes me think about, it seems like it's not enough to just not know. So like, there's so much stuff I don't know, and right. I'm happy to admit I don't know it. Same. I don't really know any chemistry. I don't know any physics. Don't ask me questions about those things. And I'm perfectly happy to tell you I don't know those things. And it doesn't really make me feel like an incompetent person that I don't know those things, because I'm kind of like, I don't know them, but I have my things that I know that are important to me. And that kind of seems what's important. So like, I think the heartbreaking thing about COVID, I know you said you don't want to talk about the big things, but
no,
we can talk about COVID a little bit.
Go ahead.
It's just how politicized it became. And so I think that was not just that people felt like, I don't know, and you're telling me that something that I don't know. It was people came to believe a wrong thing and then were told you're wrong. And it's that like having a belief that you are attached to, and that in some ways is important and is about your identity. So for some people, it's very important to be the kind of person who is opposed to government control. That's like an important idea for some people. And I think then it comes down to source bias and source untrustworthiness and about who is an expert for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, not everybody thinks scientists are experts or that their expertise is relevant to them. Sometimes like lived experience is the true expert, or that God is the expert, right? And so again, it just all comes down to perception. There's no like the objective qualifications of somebody is not relevant as much as someone's perception of who the relevant expert is in their life. So I guess, yeah, I think people don't like being told they're wrong. And I think that's especially true when they like have a belief already, and especially if it's an important belief to them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Again, it does go back to perception, which is, that's a really tricky thing. Because our perceptions are wrong all the time. And I'm not saying every perception is wrong. I'm just saying we have perceptions and they can be wrong. Or they're, I wouldn't say wrong, they can be less accurate to the thing, right? The example I kind of give is, if I see somebody, assault an old lady crossing the street, and I'm from a building across the street, and then there's another building across the street, and then there's people on the, and I'm, 6 stories up and the other person's 10 stories up. And then there's someone that's right next to the old woman. And then there's someone that's in the coffee shop right next to, behind them. There's all these different perception points, all these vantage points. And if you ask, you get all 10 of them in a room and you say, hey, what happened? You're going to get 10 different stories because they only had their perception. We never have the 360 gestalt of what's going on, which is fine. But to feel so adamantly certain that your perception is the perception. Like, well, I saw it. It's like, yeah, you could take an even bigger example. Like, well, if when I talk to young people now, I'll say like, like you were there when 9/11 happened? Yes. And what happened? So, well, I'll give my personal story, right? But if you ask everybody, they all have a different story. Mm-hmm. And there's the facts about what happened, right? But then how it happened and motivations, and then there's definitely conspiracy theories about that. But the point is that there's different perceptions, right? And neither one of them is 100% accurate. And not that it's trying to be misleading. It's just one vantage point. But even all that to say, even for someone that has a perception about something, the hard part about it is saying, because this is where the affective quality becomes into play, is it feels right, or it feels accurate, right? And if it isn't, or it is not completely, or it's incomplete, that's hard to square sometimes with how we feel about it. We can feel very strongly about it, but if we're like, we find out that like, maybe we got it wrong, it's hard. The feeling piece of it comes in where it's like, well, we don't want to let that go. Mm-hmm. And so then we double down and we say, well, no, like, and this is hard on this is, again, the unifying piece there is that that's a human experience. I mean, maybe for other animals as well, you will, there are things about that, right? Where you kind of mentioned, if Obama does something that's out of character, that's going to be hard for people to accept. It's like, no, he wouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. It's like, maybe he did. The same thing. If Trump does something that's out of character, oh, well, he wouldn't do that. Well, maybe he did. And people will say, no, I know what this is. And it's like, well, you have a perception, right? The perceived element of it, right? And so, but when we have some type of emotional investment, I think it kind of ossifies things much more, and then it's harder to change. So in the idea about vaccines or with the masks or other types of things to try and prevent the virus from spreading, there's too much disinformation. You know, we don't know where it comes from. We don't know how it got here. We don't really know how it spreads. We definitely can't trust all these people in medicine. We can't trust people in government. And so when you put enough distrust in institutions or in experts or in science, then no one can believe anything. And then everyone is just trying to say, well, no one knows anything. And that's not right. We do know a few things. But, you know, again, I don't want to terribly bring this up. I mean, I've talked about it before, but it's kind of a rabbit trail. But, you know, this idea of, you know, some vaccines or vaccines in general cause autism is completely false. You know, most people know the story behind that, but it still persists. Mm-hmm. You know, it was 25, 30 years ago. You know, the guy had, you know, so they removed the studies. He admitted to it. I think it was 2 studies, 1 or 2 studies. It wasn't even like a bunch. And he admitted that he lied. I think he was penalized. He admitted he did it. He worked hard to go against that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't matter. That notion that vaccines might cause autism is still pretty prevalent, you know, and it's like when people want it, they want to believe it, or like, I did believe it. Now I can't be the dummy, right? I can't be the idiot that believed that. So I'm going to double down and still keep believing it. And I think, again, it's that perception thing. Perceptions are they're tricky because it's not, the philosophical argument about this is that perceptions don't necessarily, it's all you have. And so it's hard to say an objective reality. It's kind of untethered to that, because objective reality may exist, but you'll never know it completely because you can only know your perception and only make inferences about another person's perception. And so it leaves you always there's always a small gap there, which is always really difficult. But it's more of the philosophy on it. But yeah.
I mean, it's tricky because, you know, we're limited to our perceptions, which are sometimes inaccurate, sometimes they're accurate, but you're right, at least that they're limited. Yeah. But that's what we have, like you're saying. And it's interesting. I mean, it's tricky where like they can lead us to really bad places, or some biases are functional and that's why we have them, right? Sure. And so it's kind of like our brains are doing the best they can and they're not perfect, but it is really tricky that, and you, right, when you end up in a situation, I think basically every person is trying to hold correct attitudes, right? They're trying to say like, what is the truth about the world, but either by circumstance of the community they've ended up in or the set of individual differences they have, where maybe they're the kind of person who just really wants certainty and wants to reach a particular view and is really uncomfortable considering different views. That does seem like a recipe for being limited in your perspective and likely inaccurate.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, you have not made me a convert to chocolate ice cream, but I am still open to considering changing my viewpoint. So
very good.
Yeah. I have to say, Laura, it was such a blast having you come on and talk about all this stuff. I absolutely love your research. And I think it's really, really awesome. Some of my good friends are social psychologists. You guys are a fun bunch. I like what you guys do, and I like the work you're doing. And so it's really, really lovely to talk with you about all this stuff. Where can people find you online? Where can they find your work? Where's the right places that you want to point people to?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on my website. So laura-e-wallace.com, or you can find me on Google Scholar. I'm Laura E. Wallace, or I'm on Twitter. Again, Laura E. Wallace. There's a good number of Laura Wallaces. I'm the one with the E, apparently, for now, until there's another one.
No, that's great. That's great. I will, of course, put all of that in the notes in the description. Thank you for coming on and such a lovely conversation. I really did enjoy it. I love thinking and talking about this stuff, and pushing and pulling on certain ideas, and so it's I really enjoyed it.
Agreed. This was very lovely. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Of course. All right. Thank you.